The first smoke rose at dawn, curling above the trees like black fingers pointing toward the heavens. At first, the women within the stone hall thought it was only the farmers burning brush, a sign of spring's clearing. But then came the horns. Deep and guttural, their notes were unlike any the village's own watchmen used. They carried across the river like a roar from some ancient beast, shaking windows and sending shivers through the bones of all who heard. Lady Astrid, daughter of Earl Halvard, stood by the long window and clutched the sill so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her father had ridden out with the men 2 nights before, answering a call from the king's court, leaving only old guards to protect the household. She had always believed the tall stone walls and the wealth of her family made them untouchable. But as the shouts grew nearer and the clash of steel rang over the hills, she realized that noble blood did not make one immune to terror. The first sight of the longships froze her heart. Sleek and dark, they slid across the river like predators. The dragon-headed prows gleamed with wetness as if hungering for the village before them. The oars dipped in perfect rhythm, and the shields that lined the sides glinted red as the sun broke fully over the horizon. Around Astrid, women clutched one another, whispering prayers. Some wept. Others stood silent, their lips trembling but no sound escaping. The attack began not at the gates, but at the shore. The Vikings set torches to the outer houses, driving, panicked villagers screaming toward the keep. Smoke thickened, and soon the air inside the stone hall stung the eyes. Astrid ordered the maids to gather the younger girls and lead them into the cellar, where barrels of grain and wine could perhaps serve as barricades. She did not know if hiding was salvation or a slower death, but command was the only way she could keep herself from breaking apart. The hall doors splintered before noon. The old guards fought bravely, their spears flashing, but they were too few. The invaders swarmed in with axes and shields, their voices a thunder of rage and triumph. Astrid found herself dragged into the center of the hall with the other women, her golden hair torn loose from its braids. The leader of the raiders towered above the rest, his beard plaited with silver rings, his eyes pale as ice. He looked upon the terrified noblewomen not as individuals but as spoils. The air was thick with screams and smoke. Children cried in corners. One woman fainted, another begged in broken Norse for mercy. The leader ignored their words. He raised a hand and the chaos dulled. His men fell back into rough order, herding the women together with spear points. It was clear this was no aimless slaughter. They had come for wealth, for cattle, for silver, but also for them. Astrid's heart hammered so hard she thought it might shatter her ribs. She forced herself to meet the raider's gaze, though terror clutched her throat. To look down felt like surrender. To look up was defiance. Somewhere, she remembered her father's words. A noblewoman carries her house upon her shoulders, even in ruin. But what weight could dignity hold against chains? The Vikings bound the captives with rope and pushed them onto the muddy courtyard. Around them, the once proud estate burned. Sparks drifted on the wind like fireflies, landing on hair and fabric. Smoke turned the sky gray. Astrid stumbled as she was forced forward, the stones sharp beneath her slippers. She dared not look back at the hall, for she knew its fall was also her own. When at last they were driven to the longships, Astrid's legs trembled with exhaustion. Yet she kept walking. Each step carried her farther from the world she had known. Her father's laughter, the hymns sung at feasts, the embroidered hangings her mother had stitched. Each step carried her into silence, into the unspoken fate that no tale sung by skalds ever told. As the ships pushed away from the shore, Astrid stood among the women, chained and shivering. Behind them, the land of her birth shrank, still burning, still screaming. Before them only the sea stretched vast and merciless. She knew the horizon held no homecoming, only uncertainty, perhaps worse. The dragon-headed prow cut through the waves, and the women's cries were lost in the endless roar of the ocean. Astrid closed her eyes, whispering a prayer not to be heard, but to remind herself that she still had a voice, however small. What awaited them across the sea no one spoke of aloud. But each woman felt it pressing down like a shadow, heavier than any chain. The voyage stretched across days that bled together into a haze of salt and fear. The women huddled near the mast, their wrists rubbed raw from the ropes that bound them. The sea was not kind. Waves slammed against the hull, tossing them into one another until bruises bloomed on their arms and legs. Above, gulls cried, circling like spirits waiting for the living to fail. The Vikings seemed immune to the chaos, their bodies moving in perfect rhythm as they rowed, drank, and laughed. For them, the storm was a test of strength. For the captives, it was a reminder that even the ocean itself bent to their captor's will. Astrid tried to keep her eyes on the horizon, to imagine she could still see the faint outline of her homeland, though it had long since vanished. Every memory of home cut into her like a blade. She recalled her mother teaching her to weave, her brothers sparring with wooden swords, her father kissing her forehead before leaving for the king's hall. Would they ever know what had become of her? Or would they believe she perished in the flames another voice silenced in a raid? The thought both comforted and tormented her. At night, the women whispered among themselves. Their voices were low, fragile, as though the very air might betray them. Some prayed in Latin, others recited fragments of lullabies. One, a widow named Elin, rocked back and forth, humming until sleep overtook her. It was in those hushed hours that Astrid understood the true meaning of silence. It was not merely the absence of sound, but the weight of words left unspoken, the fears no one dared to voice, the questions no one could answer. The raiders treated them as possessions. They threw scraps of bread and strips of dried fish toward the captives, laughing when the women scrambled for them. Astrid refused at first, her pride flaring, but hunger gnawed with relentless teeth. Eventually she bent to pick at the offerings like the rest, tears burning in her eyes. Pride could not fill an empty belly. When the ship at last reached the northern coast, the women were herded ashore. The air was colder than Astrid had ever known, sharp enough to sting her lungs. The landscape was stark, jagged cliffs, dark, forests and villages huddled against the wind. They were driven into one such settlement, where wooden halls smoked from their roofs and children stared wide-eyed at the new arrivals. The villagers looked at the captives not with pity, but with curiosity, as though livestock had been brought for trade. Inside the great hall, the captives were lined up before the chieftain. He was not the same leader who had stormed Astrid's home, but another man, broader, with a heavy iron necklace that marked his authority. He inspected the women one by one, asking questions in a tongue Astrid only partly understood. When he came to her, his gaze lingered. He touched her chin, tilting her face upward. She wanted to spit in his eyes, but fear kept her still. He murmured something to his men, and she was pulled aside, separated from the others. That night, Astrid was given a place not in the cellar with the other captives, but in a smaller chamber off the hall. She realized, with a coldness that hollowed her chest, that she was no longer merely a prisoner. She was to be claimed, set apart, perhaps as concubine, perhaps as trophy. The chains on her wrists were removed, yet the weight upon her shoulders grew heavier. She lay on the furs provided, staring at the beams above, listening to the muffled sobs of the others carried through the walls. Days turned into weeks. Astrid learned fragments of the Norse tongue from the women who served in the hall. Some were slaves like her, taken years before, their accents still betraying their homelands. They taught her which tasks would earn her food, which words to avoid speaking, which gestures signaled danger. Through them, she learned that silence was both shield and weapon. Speak too much, and you risked anger. Say nothing, and you preserved a fragment of self the raiders could not reach. Her life became a rhythm of unseen chains. She spun wool. She poured mead. She sang when commanded, though her voice quavered. The chieftain seemed amused by her bearing, the way she carried herself, with a dignity that refused to crumble. Some nights when the hall was filled with laughter and the fire roared, she stood by his side, her smile a mask, her silence her armor. Yet within her silence, rebellion brewed. Astrid listened. She watched. She learned the customs of this harsh, new world, the feasts, the rituals, the rivalries among men. And in every detail she sought not only survival, but the faint glimmer of power. But still, when she lay awake in the quiet hours, memories haunted her. She saw her homeland in flames. She saw her father riding toward a court that no longer existed for her. She felt the weight of all the noble women whose fates had been sealed not by death, but by this life of bondage and silence. Their stories would never be sung. Their names would vanish into the void, unless someone found a way to speak them. Astrid swore, silently, that she would. Winter settled upon the northern coast like an unyielding hand. Snow thickened the thatched roofs, and the sea itself seemed to stiffen under the weight of frost. In the great hall, fires blazed and shadows danced, but Astrid felt the cold more keenly than any chill in the air. It lived inside her now, a frost laid down by memory, by silence, by the unspoken burden carried by every captive woman who breathed but did not live. Yet with winter also came change. The chieftain grew older before her eyes, his cough rougher, his steps slower. The feast still filled the nights with noise, but the tension within the hall had shifted. Rivalries simmered among the warriors, whispers of new raids clashing with hunger, gnawed by barren fields. Astrid watched carefully, each glance and word feeding her growing sense of the cracks within this iron world. She had learned the tongue well enough now to follow their quarrels. She listened when the men mocked one another over cups of mead, when the women grumbled over work, when the elders muttered about omens. With every word, Astrid pieced together the map of power around her. She was not free, but she was not blind either. In silence she had suffered. In silence, she had also gathered weapons. Knowledge, patience, endurance. Each sharpened quietly, each hidden beneath the mask of obedience. It was during the longest night of the year, when the hall shook with drunken chants and the smell of roasted meat filled the air, that fate shifted. A fight broke out between two young warriors, blades flashing in the firelight. The chieftain roared at them to stop, but his voice was thin, his authority cracking. Astrid stood near him, the mead horn heavy in her hand. For a moment, as the hall erupted, she felt something stir deep within her, a realization that she was no longer merely surviving, she was waiting. In the days that followed, the chieftain's cough worsened. He called upon Astrid often, asking her to sing, to pour, to stand by him, as though her presence might lend him strength. Some of the others resented this, their glares, sharp when they thought she would not see. But Astrid had learned to endure glares, whispers, and worse. What she did not endure was despair. Quietly, she began to weave threads of her own. She comforted the other captive women, teaching them words she had learned, reminding them in hushed tones that they were not voiceless. She listened when they wept, gave them fragments of courage when their hands shook. Her resolve hardened one night when Elin, the widow who had hummed lullabies on the ship, collapsed from fever. None tended to her but Astrid. She wiped her brow, whispered prayers in her ear, and when the fever claimed her, Astrid closed her eyes gently. The hall carried on with its noise, indifferent. Astrid buried Elin with her own hands in the frozen earth, her tears freezing on her cheeks. That night she swore she would not let every woman's memory sink into the snow, lost and unnamed. Spring broke the grip of frost, and with it, the chieftain's life slipped away. His death left the hall unmoored. The warriors divided over who should rule. Battles broke out not only on the sea but in their own hearth. Through it all, Astrid kept her silence, her mask, her patience. But within that silence, she spoke to those who would listen, the women, the slaves, the overlooked. She told them they were not mere spoils, not forgotten, but threads in a larger tapestry. She told them stories of her homeland, of halls where women advised earls, of songs where names endured. At first they listened only in secret. Then, as rivalries among the men grew bloodier, they leaned closer, clung harder to her words. A quiet alliance began to form, not of swords, but of memory, of resolve, of survival. Astrid had no army, no banners, but she had voices that began to rise, even if only in whispers. Years later, when her hair bore streaks of gray and her eyes had weathered storms of more kinds than one, Astrid's story spread beyond the hall. Traders carried it across seas, fragments of a tale about a noble woman who endured, who remembered, who taught others to remember. Not all who heard believed it. Many dismissed it as myth, a woman's tale not worth the scald's ink. But still it traveled, like embers carried on the wind, refusing to be extinguished. Astrid knew she would never see her homeland again. But she also knew her silence had not been wasted. Within it, she had built a truth that no conqueror could erase. That the fate of noble women after conquest was not only suffering but also endurance, defiance, and the quiet rewriting of destiny. Her name might never be carved in stone, nor sung in longhouses beside the names of kings. Yet in the unspoken spaces of history she remained. A shadow, a whisper, a flame that endured through silence. And in that endurance her fate was no longer hidden.